I'd just like to say in advance that this video is being taped for publishment on websites and also YouTube. Some of the things you will see I do not have the rights to, but this is being done for educational purposes. I'd like to thank everybody for watching this video in advance. My name is Walt Mussel. I'm an author from Buford, Georgia. I write historical fiction and fantasy set in medieval Japan. And welcome to my presentation, The Path to Silence, Japan's Christian Century and Beyond. When you talk about Japan's Christian century, you're looking at basically roughly the mid-16th century to the mid-17th. In 1549, a group of 6 Jesuit missionaries landed right about here in Kagoshima, on the southernmost of Kyushu, southernmost of Japan's 4 main islands, and asked the local daimyo or feudal governor permission to preach and build a mission. The events those 6 men set in motion would see Japan within 60 years have hundreds of thousands of converts. But with the change in political winds, the converts would, and the entire religion would be driven underground under penalty of death. It actually starts about 6 years earlier. In 1543, a Chinese junk with 2 or 3 Portuguese merchants on board was forced to land at the small island of Tanegashima, which you see by the red arrow here on the map right about here, just south of Kyushu. For the Chinese sailors on board, I'm guessing it was no big deal. China and Japan had been dealing with each other for over 1,000 years. But for the Portuguese merchants, Marco Polo's fabled land of Chipangu, the land that hoarded gold, had just jumped from fable to reality. Word quickly spread through the Portuguese outposts in the Indies and East Indies, in Malacca, the Spice Islands, and in Goa, India, where they were headquartered. And the Portuguese began sending ships every year as the winds allowed to improve trade. The Catholic Church decided to use the Portuguese exploration efforts to funnel the missionary work they wanted to do for the faith. They began building their own missions and seminaries in areas where the Portuguese already had outposts. One such missionary was a man named Francis Xavier. Xavier was a founding member of what was called the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits. Xavier wasn't even supposed to go on a mission. He was a last-minute replacement when another missionary who was supposed to go got gravely ill. So he accepted the challenge and headed for Goa, India. In those days, the way you got to Goa from Portugal was that you would leave in March, or at the latest, early April. You would sail south around the Cape of Good Hope, and then go north between the Madagascar and the African continent. Once past Madagascar, you would catch the monsoon winds that would take you across the Indian Ocean in roughly 6 weeks. If you were late, if you were on time, you'd get there maybe September, October of the same year. If you were late, you would be stuck there for a year waiting for the monsoon winds to come back. Xavier was late. He didn't make it to Goa until 1542. But once he got there, he began doing missionary work, particularly in southern India, in the places where Thomas the Apostle, also Doubting Thomas, had founded churches. He spent 3 years there before branching out into the Spice Islands and Malacca. It was in Malacca that he met a samurai named Yajiro. Yajiro was also from Kyushu. And he had been found complicit in a murder. He had fled Japan with two of his companions. And in his travels through the East Indies, he had heard of Francis Xavier and this new religion of forgiveness. And he sought him out. If the stories are to be believed, Yajiro actually interrupted a wedding when he finally found Xavier. Xavier was so moved by Yajiro's desire for the religion, he baptized him and both of his companions and was inspired to go to Japan. They returned to Goa, India, and then from Goa did some language studies and theological studies, and then made their way for Japan. They landed in August of 1549 right here in what's called Kagoshima. Kagoshima was where where Yajiro was from. They asked permission to build a mission. And the daimyo, and I use the term feudal governor and daimyo interchangeably, it is the same thing, agreed. Because in the 6 years between the time the original ship had shown up with the Portuguese merchants and this ship with missionaries, word had spread of this new group of people from other side of the world. Xavier was immediately taken with the Japanese. He called them the greatest people not yet discovered. At the same time, he was perplexed, particularly by the language. He said the Japanese language was invented by the devil to prevent him from bringing the gospel to the heathens. Xavier had little success when he started out. Didn't quite know why. But he realized that the power within Japan resided in a place called Miyako, which is roughly about here. It's modern-day Kyoto, and that's where the capital was. So Xavier traveled by land all the way up here to hope to meet the emperor. The emperor refused him. Finally, when he gave up, he decided to come back and go to where he'd been. And somewhere along the way, he figured out what the issue was with his approach. To preach to the Japanese people, one of the traditional evangelical methods that worked in Europe and that also worked in India did not work in Japan. But the Jesuits were a well-educated bunch. And the thing that the Japanese appreciated was learning new things about science, mathematics, other areas. So Xavier used his educational background to initially introduce himself, and then would turn to preaching. He got all the way down here to what's now modern-day Yamaguchi Prefecture, where he began speaking, converting hundreds of people to the faith. And his fame continued to spread to where a daimyo here asked to speak to him. The daimyo was Otomo Yoshishige, later Otomo Soren. Soren was his Buddhist name, though he did eventually convert to Christianity. At the time, Soren was only roughly 20-some years old, but he wanted to know about this new religion, but also he wanted trade, just like everybody else. Soren was so moved by his meetings with Xavier, he gave him land for hospitals, missions, anything they wanted, free reign to go anywhere in the country, in his domain at least. Satisfied, Xavier found the place where they could start, but at the same time, he had learned that Japan has a great respect for China's culture. And that was the way other things, other goods, other religion had come to Japan. So he started to work on he wanted to work on what was called a Japan through China strategy. So he's made the plan. He left his team in place and decided to return to Goa with the eventual idea of entering China and spreading the faith there, and then hoping the spread would go to Japan. Unfortunately, he left in 1551. Unfortunately, he died in 1552, waiting to enter China. And as I said about Soren, he was so moved. He always opened this place up, and he even sent delegations to Goa in the 1550s in order to expand trade. Other missionaries soon followed, and there were some initial challenges. One, people thought Christianity was another sect of Buddhism. Why? Buddha's from India. The Catholics were headquartered in Goa. This basically seemed appropriate. In addition, Yajiro, who did a lot of the translating, Japanese language didn't have at the time words for expressing Christian concepts. So Yajiro grabbed on to other Japanese Buddhist terms and trying to explain the language. This also made Christianity sound Buddhist. Lastly, about 1555, the Jesuits sort of realized what was going on. So they began using Latin and Portuguese terms in order to explain the faith. And this seemed to help them get the message across. At the same time, it brought problems because now the Buddhists realized that they were not another sect of Buddhism, but a competitive religion. Among these challenges, you had some progress and growing pains. In 1563, Omura Sumitada, and I'm using last names first when I speak a Japanese name, it was by convention. Omura Sumitada, who controls this area right here, which includes Nagasaki, became the first warlord baptized. And I say the area of Nagasaki, he became very devout about this. And once he started baptized, this meant that people under him wanted to be baptized as well. And so conversions began happening more frequently. Nagasaki would soon play a key role for what the Jesuits were doing. Why? At the time in 1563, Nagasaki is a fishing village. It's not even a city. But by 1570, they make it a little bigger because of the ability. Nagasaki had deep water ports that could be used for the Portuguese ships, and it provided an ample opportunity for money to flow into Sumitada's domain. But among some of the challenges, in the 1570 to 1580, the Jesuit mission was run by a Father Francisco Cabral. Cabral was your typical Eurocentric, what I do is better than anybody else from the time period. He tried to grow the faith, and converts were added, but it was seen as stagnating. Why? They really needed to recruit Japanese clergy in order to spread the faith. And if you're forcing people to basically adopt to your way of doing things, this was a poor method they used. Father Louis Frost, who was the mission translator, noted that they had roughly 50 people within the Jesuits, priests and others, trying to spread the faith, but only 7 of them were Japanese, and that was no way to work. This is a picture of Frost. It's the only thing I could find. It's a postage stamp that Portugal issued years ago to honor him. Frost was a gifted linguist, as well as a very observant individual. He worked heavily in Miyako, Kyoto, to establish the faith. Starting with, in 69, they had a converted Buddhist temple. So dilapidated, they had to abandon the building if the weather got bad, because they were afraid it would fall on them. But by 1576, they managed to build the first church in Kyoto. It was called the Church of the Assumption of Our Lady. The first Mass was celebrated August of 1576. Ironically, though, the Japanese had a different name for it. They called it Nambanji, or Nanbandera, the Temple of the Southern Barbarians. How did they get a name for Southern Barbarians? Well, one, when you come into Japan in those days, you came up from the south, and that was where the southern part came from. But the Chinese had also been calling the Portuguese barbarians. Why? Well, the initial impression, and the Japanese agreed with it, that these Portuguese merchants and sailors, they were illiterate. They cursed. They ate with their hands. And they didn't bathe. By both culture standards, that was a barbarian. There were some growing pains also with money. The man at the top, Alessandro Valignano, was the father visitor in Goa, India. He was in charge of all missionary efforts in the East Indies and the Indies. And when he's looking at this, Japan had a very complex gift-giving culture, which the Jesuits were trying to engage in, but that cost a lot of money in order to meet high-ranking people and try to get permission to spread the faith. And so one of the things that Valignano did was he arranged for the Jesuits to be invested in the silk trade. The silk trade the Portuguese had gotten heavily involved because there had been some friction between China and Japan over reported Japanese piracy, which limited the amount of Japanese ships that could go to China and get silk. So the Portuguese stepped in and provided that niche, bringing silk to Japan every year. But this was a bad thing. Why? Church law expressly forbid clerics from engaging in any form of merchant or trade. But Valignano said he had no other option. Valignano also created a mission of 4 teenage samurai from down here in Kyushu to go to Europe and present what was going on in Japan to spread the faith and hopefully raise funds. One missionary was Sumitada's, one was one was Soren's, and then another daimyo that was there. If you have Amazon Prime, look for something called the Ten Show Boys Embassy. There is a 10-part series, Tensho. But the thing that really helped the Jesuits was that in 1580, Sumitada ceded the administration of Nagasaki to the Jesuits for the shipping, and this greatly funded church operations. But the other issue we talked about, I mentioned Cabral. Cabral had that focus on adopting people, forcing people to adopt to Western culture, and that wasn't working. So what did Valignano do? The first thing he did was he fired Cabral. But the second thing he did was he looked at the Japanese citizens and he said, you know, we may have better technology, but the Japanese have a better culture. So he created a set of rules requiring the Jesuits to follow them. First, he required 2 years of language study for any missionary that wanted to go to Japan. I know in our time period that sounds rather obvious, but back then it wasn't. He said, we got to learn a Japanese diet. It's more healthy. Learn to eat with chopsticks. These are better manners. Tea ceremony, very prominent in Japan, and even the Jesuits fell in love with tea ceremony eventually. And the last one was the baths. There was basically an antipathy toward bathing from the Europeans. They did finally agree to baths once a month in winter and twice a month in summer. And these changes helped with the recruitment of local clergy. Lastly, Valignano said, stay out of Japanese politics. Unfortunately, the Jesuits would not listen to that one. At the time when the Jesuits first arrived, Japan had been through roughly 80 years of civil war. But in the latter half of the 16th century, Japan was unified by 3 leaders. And each of these leaders made decisions on Christians based on the money available and also the politics. The first one was Oda Nobunaga. I have him listed as convenient friend, and that's a reference to Japanese textbooks. Take it from Nobunaga's perspective. Christianity, if you look at trying to unify Japan like a chessboard, Christianity is just one pawn on that chessboard. He had numerous people against him. In particular, he had what it's going to sound really odd to say, militant sects of Buddhism. Several centuries prior, competing sects of Buddhism in order to spread their own faith, had actually developed their own mercenary armies. And these were problems today. They were problems that Nobunaga was facing in trying to unify the country. They fought each other a lot, but they all had one thing in common. They wanted Nobunaga dead. Why was he convenient to the Christians? The one thing Nobunaga realized is that the Christians weren't trying to kill him. So he thought, I can work with these people. What do they want? And he said, well, they want to build churches. He said, I'm okay with that. And so Nobunaga, using them, as I said, like a piece on the chessboard, in trying to unify the country to deal with the Buddhists. And the Christians provided extra incentive because of a policy that some of the Christian daimyos had for destroying Buddhist temples once they converted to Christianity. Nobunaga came from Owari. It's near Nagoya, right up here. Sorry, a little bit over. The little red area right there. Nobunaga took his father's position in 1551 when his father passed away. This is the same year that Xavier left Japan. Nobunaga did not even control the entire area of Owari, and the part he did control, nobody wanted him there. Why? He was considered to be rude. He's considered to be not very good, not very bright. He had misbehaved at his father's own funeral and had earned the nickname the Fool of Owari. But Nobunaga managed to consolidate his forces under his half of Owari and then later taking it over within about 10 years. From there, he spread out, trying to unite as much of Japan as he possibly could. In 1582, one of Nobunaga's generals turned traitor and had his samurai surround the temple in Kyoto where Nobunaga was staying. Nobunaga was assassinated, which by Japanese standards means once he realized there was nothing he could do, Nobunaga took his own life. When Nobunaga started, like I said, he didn't even have Owari. When Nobunaga died, he had united all of the area in purple. Roughly from a geographical standpoint, anywhere from a third to a half of the country. Next up is Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Hideyoshi was also from Owari, and he had served Nobunaga. He had risen from the son of a low-level foot soldier to one of his generals. And he was the general who avenged Nobunaga against the traitor, defeating the forces of the traitor, and then the traitor was later killed within 13 days after he did it. Hideyoshi jockeyed for position with other generals, eventually taking over. And in looking at the Christians, he afforded the priests a sizable presence in Kyushu where they were. But at the same time, he was a bit suspicious. Why? Well, in looking at what he was doing, he had looking at the militant ways that, and we don't know for certain because Hideyoshi didn't write any of this down, but in looking at the militant ways that the Buddhists had become mercenary in some ways, he saw the Christians and the Portuguese and everything going on and wondered, is it sort of the same thing? What's in control? How can I use this? And he did it as best he could. Eventually, he grew suspicious of the Christians even more. And that was due to a man named Gaspar Collioure. Collioure was the provincial superior from Kyushu. In trying to unite the country, Hideyoshi took out the Chosokabe clan, which is the area of the middle pink, right about here, in around 1585. In 1586, he invited the Jesuits to Osaka Castle. And Collioure was there, Frost was there taking notes, and we don't have any notes from, we only have Frost's notes from these meetings. We don't have anything from the Japanese side. But at this meeting, Hideyoshi let the Jesuits know that once he finished uniting the country, he planned to take Korea and China. And he asked for 2 ships from the Portuguese to escort his own troops. And Collioure, basically operating his own without authorization, was saying, no problem. We can help you there. We can even give you other troops. And then Collioure stepped way over the line in a way that the rest of the whole mission would love to never happened. Soren, down here, was having issues with the Shimazu clan, the lower pink area. The Shimazu clan was moving up and taking parts of Soren's territory. What Collioure suggested was that he could unify the Christian samurai in Kyushu and support Hideyoshi if Hideyoshi would come in and help. One, he couldn't promise that. But 2, for him to say that he can bring in anything and for him to ask Hideyoshi was stepping over the line. Soren had asked Hideyoshi, and that was fine, but Collioure had no business doing so. Hideyoshi did eventually bring his troops in 1587 and defeated the Shimazu clan. Collioure sailed to greet Hideyoshi on a ship. Hideyoshi complimented the ship greatly. And in listening to what was being said, the Christian daimyo, who were supportive of the Jesuits, were looking at Collioure and going, "You don't know what's going on here. Give Hideyoshi the ship." And he's like, no, Hideyoshi and I are friends. He thought about his time and all the discussions they'd had in Osaka Castle. "I know what I'm doing." "No, you don't." "I know. I'm going to negotiate." He wanted to negotiate for greater territory. Hideyoshi got a little upset, maybe had a little too much wine. And then in the middle of the night, Collioure was roused with 4 questions from Hideyoshi. 1, why, when you convert a daimyo, do all the people underneath seem to follow suit? You are forcing people to your faith. 2, why are you destroying the Buddhist temples? These are part of Japan. And it wasn't that Hideyoshi didn't like it. It's that if it's going to destroy a Buddhist temple, it was going to be Hideyoshi. It wasn't going to be anybody else. 3, there are reports of Portuguese ships carrying Japanese slaves to other countries and selling them, including as far away as Europe, and selling them. And for Hideyoshi, this would be sort of like, was he against slavery? He was against the slavery of Japanese citizens. It made Japanese people look bad. At the same time, as he'll show later, Hideyoshi had no problem selling people from other countries into slavery. And the last thing was, why on earth do you eat useful animals like cows and horses? Collioure tried to answer Hideyoshi, but in the end, Hideyoshi sent a note back. "Get out. You have 20 days. All of you." This was called the Hakata Edict. He basically banned every missionary and told them to leave. Collioure first argued that said, "We can't leave. It's the summer. The ships won't be here until later in the year. The winds to take us back won't be here until November. We can't do anything. And Hideyoshi had to accept that. But at the same time, he wanted to make examples of what was going on. One of his daimyo was a guy named Takayama Ukon. Ukon was one of the Christian daimyo. He didn't have the largest fief, but he was the most zealous, and he was the most outspoken. So Hideyoshi sent a note to Ukon and said, I'll give you a choice. Surrender your faith or surrender your fief. It didn't take Ukon long to answer. The answer was no. Actually, Nobunaga had asked him the same question years ago. He had said no back then. So Ukon lost his fief and was transferred and basically worked under another daimyo for most of the rest of his life. Hideyoshi destroyed nearly 1/4 of the locations in Japan. Most of the churches in Nagasaki, and then the cathedral in Kyoto among them. His whole purpose was, in some ways, to downplay activities. He wanted the Jesuits to stop. He still didn't know, can I separate the Jesuits from the army? Can I separate the faith from the merchants? And that is speculation. And even though he did tamp it down, in fact, in a few years, in 1591, Hideyoshi would be seen parading around his palace wearing Portuguese clothes and carrying a rosary. But officially, only 2 people had the ability to be in the country. One was Valignano. He was considered an ambassador, and he could visit anytime he wanted. The second was a guy named João Rodrigues. And that's a book, Rodrigues the Interpreter. I can find no picture of Rodrigues to put on the screen. Rodrigues was an example of how the Jesuits, and how merchants recruited back in the 16th century. What they would do back then is if you came from a poor or low family, you would be elementary school age and you would sign on to be like a cabin boy or a servant to a priest or another merchant. And so you would go to the West Indies. So he's like elementary school age. He's on his own in the Indies seeking his fortune. He eventually makes it to Japan, still as a child, and grows up in part of Japan, learns the language like a native. His language skills were brilliant. He was eventually recruited by the Jesuits and became a priest. But the Jesuits were about to become victims of their own success. What do I mean by that? In 1586, Pope Sixtus V authorized Spain's visitor in the Philippines to visit Japan. What had just happened is that they had prior to this, Japan had been operating as part of an administrative region of a larger area. But in the 1580s, the Pope said, I'm going to make Japan its own domain. What did this mean? It meant the Jesuits no longer had a monopoly. Other groups, other orders of priests could visit. So you got the Augustinians, you got the Dominicans, and the Franciscans, which were heavily in the Philippines. The first friars that intended to stay arrived in 1593, and this was seen as circumventing the edict, the Hakata Edict. They talked with Hideyoshi in Osaka, and they thought they got permission to have a house within the country. They thought they had permission to have a church in Kyoto as well, which they founded. And that would come back to haunt them later. But what were the differences? What was the problem? Well, they had different ways of doing things. The Franciscans regarded the Jesuits as timid. The Jesuits were saying Mass behind locked doors to keep things tamped down. They were dressing like Japanese people. And they were also critical of the trading practices that the Jesuits were doing and the fact that the Jesuits had started marrying Christians with non-Christians. As for the Franciscans, They were straightforward, in your face, and they had a very simplistic attitude about the way they were operating. The Jesuits said, "You're in over your head. You've got to stop this." And they called them frail idiota, or simple friars, for their approach toward Hideyoshi. And then came the San Felipe incident. In 1596, the San Felipe, a Spanish ship, set sail from the Philippines to Acapulco. In those days, you didn't go straight. What you did was they went north from down here up towards Japan, took the current across, and then went back down. They left too late in the year. Got hit by 2 typhoons. The rudder was destroyed. They made for Japan, landing somewhere about here on the island of Shikoku. They got hit by another storm in the meantime, lost part of their shipment. And this was in 1596. Well, what had happened since then? Hideyoshi had finished his quest to conquer Japan. That one remaining pink area, if you remember the map, was Edo, which is modern-day Tokyo. He had done that in 1590, and now he had to look for new fields. And so, as he mentioned to the Jesuits years ago, he was going towards Korea and China. But going towards Korea proved costly, and they lost a lot of money and retreated. In addition, in 1596, there was a huge earthquake in Kyoto. The treasury was broke. They needed money. They looked at the ship and said, "Everything is ours under the right of salvage." The San Felipe's pilot made a comment that sort of said, "You know, Spain dominates by sending in priests first." This comment got all the way to Hideyoshi, and he was livid. He ordered the execution of local Christians throughout the area. There were negotiations and apologies back and forth. Finally, they narrowed it down, saying that, well, this was the San Felipe. This was a Spanish ship. The Franciscans are Spanish. They built that church in Kyoto that shouldn't be there. And so, from the church, they took the 5 Franciscan friars and 15 laity. They added the Franciscan friar from the San Felipe, and then they found 3 Jesuits in a house in Osaka that wasn't supposed to be there either. Those 24 were mutilated, had a nose and an ear cut off, paraded around Kyoto, Osaka, and Sakai, and then marched to Nagasaki. On their way, 2 people who gave them comfort en route would eventually join them. And on February 5th, 1597, these men were all executed. They were executed in Nagasaki via crucifixion. Was the crucifixion a poke in the eye of Christianity? Maybe. There were other ways to execute in Japan. But crucifixion was also a Japanese method, and they were executed Japanese style. Back, if you remember from your history, the way the Romans did it, they left them on the cross until they died, unless it was the wrong day to do so. In Japan, they took 2 people with spears. They ran them hip to opposite shoulder, crossing inside the body. Everybody was dead by mid-morning. Hideyoshi died in 1598, and for the religious orders, they breathed something of a sigh of relief. Hideyoshi's actions had been seen as him going crazy. But they thought, well, what can we do? We've got. So Hideyoshi had one son, age 5, when he died. And he created a council of elders hoping to bring up his son until he was old enough to rule. The Jesuits were looking at this and thinking, okay, we can breathe a little easier. The most likely winner of all these people was Tokugawa Ieyasu. And they said, well, Ieyasu likes us. So if he wins out, we're good. If the others he fights, and the others fight him and it goes on, well, then they're going to be too busy to even notice us. Not a problem. Ieyasu did create dissension, and he defeated the Toyotomi Loyalists 2 years later in 1600. He was named shogun in 1603, and then in 1605 he passed the title of shogun down to his son Hidetada. This is what Hideyoshi couldn't do. Hideyoshi was unable to pass his title down to a successor. And when Hidetada took on the role of shogun, it didn't mean Ieyasu was close to death. No, he was letting his son grow into the role while he still pulled the strings. But there were other challenges. In 1600, the Dutch discovered the location of Japan. When a Dutch ship, the Leaf Day, a replica of which is at the bottom right corner, reached Japan in 1600. On board was an Englishman named William Adams. He was the pilot of the ship, and he is the basis for shogun. Adams would learn Japanese and become an advisor to Ieyasu, providing him specifically with long-range ship technology, something which the Jesuits and the Franciscans had said no on, fearing that the Japanese might expand, and given how well-trained and well-armed they were, that might be a problem. Eventually, Adams built the first long-range ship for Japan and eventually became a primary advisor to Ieyasu, replacing Rodriguez, the translator from the Jesuit mission. Dutch and later English traders who arrived in 1603 would push speculation, said, deal with us, don't deal with these guys. They're always going to have Rome. We promise we won't proselytize. So this was a competition. This was Catholic versus non-Catholic. And they were constantly pushing and said, we will not interrupt your religion. We will not interrupt your faith. Tensions would continue, but they would blossom in the Macau incident. The Macau incident, in 1608, a Japanese crew wintering in Macau got rowdy. And the governor, which was Captain Major Pessoa, he mobilized the guard and blew up the building where they were staying, killing a number of Japanese. In 1609, Pessoa was in charge of the black ship that was bringing silk and other goods to Japan. He was on what was either the Madre de Deus or the Nossa Senhora de Graça. I'm probably pronouncing them both wrong. The ship has two names, and I've seen it called more than one thing in both. The previous black ships, Ieyasu had tried to put some rules in place to be a little more strict, and the previous black ship captains had flaunted the rules. And so Ieyasu decided this year you're not going to do it. Pessoa bucked that and got upset. And then stories of what happened in Macau started filtering back. They demanded an investigation, else the Jesuits be expelled, the Portuguese of Nagasaki killed. This came into fighting, Japanese ships attacking the Portuguese ship. After 4 days of fighting, the Portuguese ship caught fire from all the gunpowder that was located just all over from all the fighting they were doing. And at that point, Pessoa blew up the ship, taking all hands down. This unwillingness to follow the rules and this feature toward still pressing the faith made the Tokugawa outlaw Christianity in the areas under their control. And by areas under control, they did it in Edo. They did it in Kyoto. They also had taken control of Nagasaki, where it was directly controlled by Hideyoshi. Had done the same thing. Directly controlled Nagasaki with his own governors. Tokugawas did the same thing. And began getting some of the Christian daimyo to try to change their marriages to mess up the relationships they had. And they couldn't turn down Ieyasu because he was in charge of the country. By January, February 1614, the Tokugawas issued an order that all missionaries ordered to leave by the country of the gods and the Buddha. By November, because they had to wait till November, they assembled there. They had to wait for the ships and the wind to come. They were sitting in the harbor in Nagasaki, waiting for escort ships to get out of the country. And because the winds were delayed and so were the escort ships, the missionaries were on board ships, watching the churches they built be destroyed right in front of them. There were about 300,000 plus Christians in Japan at this time, and they'd been ordered to basically renounce their faith. A number of missionaries tried staying, less than 50, different groups, so had smaller groups. That way, if one person gave up other missionaries, they couldn't affect the other groups that were trying to support the Christians in the area. Some missionaries would return later, coming on as merchants. Some were able to sneak off the boats, but in the end, less than 50 were left. There were subsequent martyrdoms. 1619, 52 Christians burned in Kyoto, including children as young as 5. The wood they used for this burning was wet, and so it smoldered. What I've read about if you're burned at the stake, you actually suffocate from the fire taking away your oxygen before you're actually burned up. But if the wood is wet, that means you are actually burned up because of the way the fire works. And so the Christians who were being burned began singing hymns. The crowd that was watching became inspired. And the government began realizing killing these people really wasn't the answer. You have to tell them to give up their faith because martyrdom makes more Christians. By 1622, trade was continuing, but they outlawed Catholicism anywhere in the country, approaching anything. Any missionary found was hunted and arrested. They didn't mean they totally stopped the martyrdoms. 1623, again in 1626. But in looking at apostasy, they came up with 2 rather devious things. The first was the fumie. They would throw an image of Jesus Christ or the Virgin Mary, originally wood, metal. They throw it on the ground and demand that people step on it. If you hesitated, you were considered to be a Christian and sent away for further interrogation. But by 1633, you had the introduction of the pit. Now, in the pit, you were basically hung upside down. They started hanging you halfway. And then if you watch the movie Silence, they actually have them, they're turned upside down, and then they're basically at the neck, that they're in a hole. That hole is filled with excrement. And so the smell is extremely foul. Originally, the first people they tried gagged. And so they would make cuts in their head, sort of like professional wrestlers, where they do that to make the blood happen. And so they would go from there, and literally people would give up the faith. Iemitsu was the grandson of Ieyasu. In 1635, he issued the closed country edict. Any Westerner teaching the faith subject to imprisonment. And also he forbade Japanese from leaving the country under penalty of death. And if they came back, they were put to death. And the last one, there were some laws issued in 1633, but not really codified, that you would inspect the ships for priests and you offered rewards for missionaries. The biggest Christian martyrdom was the Shimabara Rebellion. In 1620, the local daimyo in Shimabara, which is roughly about here, it's a peninsula, exacted a heavy tax on the Catholic population. As I said earlier, they basically were thinking they're getting rid of all them, getting to apostatize. However, there's only so much they could do with martyrdom and apostasy. Simply put, some areas were so heavily Catholic that if you basically killed everybody, you were killing the tax base. In the 1630s, a drought created hardship, but the tax remained. And under beliefs that a teenager was able to do miracles like Jesus, a teenager named Amakusa Shiro. The people rebelled in 1637. 5 months later in Hara Castle, the rebellion was quelled with 125,000 samurai and offshore bombardment by the Dutch Empire. Approximately 37,000 Christians, including Shiro, were executed. When they got into Hara Castle, they would find bullets that had been melted down and formed into the shapes of crosses to provide the people comfort. One side note, the daimyo who did all this was found to be such an idiot that he was executed for just being stupid and allowing it all to happen. In 1639, Iemitsu targeted the Portuguese and basically said, okay, he was still allowing shipping, merchants only, but no, he said, you're helping the hidden Japanese Christians, you're helping the missionaries, you're gone. Any Portuguese approach, you're executed. And then he prohibited the Dutch, Chinese, and Japanese from having missionaries on board. A lot of people say that basically Japan cut itself off from the world. And to some extent, this is correct. But at the same time, they've got the Dutch confined to a small area in Nagasaki where they allow the European goods to come in. The Chinese are coming in through Nagasaki and other places. Korea is trading with parts of Kyushu. The Ryukyus, which is the old name for Okinawa and it's down here, is trading with parts of this. So there is ongoing trade, but it gets back to an issue of control. Could they control what was going on? Gustavo Ferreira is the Liam Neeson character from the movie Silence. And this is one of the two people in the movie and the book that are actual names from the movie. You had Ferreira. He actually was on the Madre de Deos in 1609. He was one of the missionaries that were brought from Macau to Japan to start his missionary work. By 1614, he went into hiding. This is his tomb, or his tombstone. He became head of the Jesuit order in Japan, but you can't make much of this. Why? Because they'd broken up into several small groups of different orders. And so the Jesuits are organized in a very militaristic style. So if the person above you is killed, you assume their role. That's what happened to Ferreira. The people above him were killed until he took over. In 1633, he was hung in the pit. One of the people hung in the pit with him was one of the teenage samurai that went to Europe back in the 1580s. And that samurai was martyred for the faith. And Ferreira recanted. This was a surprise. Portuguese merchants who were still operating at the time, because this is only 1633, had seen Ferreira hung and had sailed off with the news that Ferreira had been martyred. And so he was being celebrated for his martyrdom until a few years later when they got back to Japan, discovered that he had apostatized and was now helping the Japanese. Ferreira would participate in interrogations in 1642 and 1643, including Father Visitor from Macau, who was killed, and Father Giuseppe Chiara, who is the Andrew Garfield character in the movie Silence, who recanted. One other person, the Inquisitor in the movie, Inoue Matsushige. That is the real name of the Inquisitor that Ferreira was dealing with at the time. One last person. You see at the front of the movie, you see the Andrew Garfield and Adam Driver characters talking to a priest. An elder priest who is saying, yes, you have permission to go. In the book, the name of that priest is Alessandro Valagnano. Endo Shusaku used the name why as honoring her because he knew it, but Valagnano had actually died in 1608, I think. And if he had been alive in 1640s when that movie was taking place, he'd been in his 90s. The religion did its best to survive in secret. Teachings were not fully absorbed, though, due to a lack of priests. And so you had a blending of the Christian beliefs along with some Buddhist and some Shinto rituals. Tasks were divided among lay people. You see in the movie, one guy goes, yes, I'm in charge of the baptism. I do the water. And that's what one person would do. Another person would do record keeping. That's how they did it. The worship services became centered around prayers and merged with Buddhist services. And one way I explain this is that if a Christian in this time period died, they were required to hold a Buddhist funeral. But there would always be one person missing in a secret room, taking rosary beads, washing them to wash away the sin of having a Buddhist instead of a Christian funeral. The Japanese government encouraged Buddhist temples to build new temples on the places where the Christian churches had been destroyed, and then required the local citizens to register. Every New Year's, they would have to go in, perform the fumie, and get a certificate saying that they were not Christian. They would go home and say an act of contrition afterwards, which is a Catholic prayer for saying, God, I'm heartily sorry for all my sins today. Please forgive me and help me sin no more. They also hid symbols. Some Christians disguise figurines of Mary to look like a female bodhisattva. They would put crosses in the backs of statues. There's a custom of having in your home shrines to family members who have passed. If these family members were Christian, they would create Buddhist shrines and put hidden compartments with Christian artifacts. But there was also one other hidden symbol. From the early days of Christian persecution, the symbol of a fish was used to indicate that these people were secret Christians. Japan had its own version. Japanese had no written language until the late 4th, early 5th century. And the first thing they did was to import characters from Japan. What did this mean? This meant every character had a Chinese pronunciation and a Japanese pronunciation. So every character's got at least 2, sometimes 3. And so if you put characters together in an unfamiliar combination, the average person isn't going to, they can guess, but they aren't certain how to pronounce them. And so for the Christians, they would see these 4 characters, very simple ones. The first 3 are taught to first graders, the last one to third graders in Japan today. But putting these 4 characters together and sounding it out, you got the image of Santa Maria, Saint Mary. And there was one symbol that wasn't so hidden. Himeji Castle is one, there are over 100 castles in Japan, but many of them have been destroyed and rebuilt. There are only, I think, 7 left that are considered original. The best-known castle is Himeji. It was the one used in the Shogun miniseries. It was the castle used in the Bond film, You Only Live Twice. It was in the Tom Cruise movie, The Last Samurai. Himeji Castle, for many years, for most of the 16th century, was 3 stories. And then in the 17th century was reconstructed into its 6-story castle that it is today, to resemble a white heron in flight. When it was only 3 stories, a tile appeared, a cross tile appeared. It was common for castles to have tiles. They were talisman against floods or fire or earthquakes. But a cross was a bit of a difference. The belief is that Hideyoshi's brother-in-law, who for a time was Christian and did put crosses in some of his family items, this might have been a tribute to him, but nobody knows. When the castle went from 3 to 6 stories, the cross was kept. If you see it in the movie, the Liam Neeson and the Andrew Garfield characters are doing what they can to eliminate every last image of Christianity they can find. But for some reason, this cross was allowed to remain open, and no one touched it, and no one questioned it. And this cross is also the inspiration for my book, The Samurai's Heart. as I postulate a way the cross might have gotten there. In 1831, the Paris Foreign Mission Society became entrusted with spreading Catholicism to Japan and also Korea. Taking up Valignano and his divisive language studies, the missionaries would first go to Okinawa to study Japanese. In 1853, 4 ships under Matthew Perry steamed into Edo Harbor and demanded that Japan open trade with the West. 2 ports were set up after that meeting, one in Hakodate up here, and then one in Shimoda down here, close to Mount Fuji. And then later on, you had the Harris Treaty, named after the Consul General Townsend Harris. This permitted Americans to practice, but not proselytize. Other treaties soon followed from other countries, and 5 more cities were opened up. And by the end of 1850s, there were several cities being served by priests. However, they were only allowed to serve as foreigners. They weren't allowed to serve as Japanese. In 1865, Ora Church was opened in Nagasaki. This is what Ora looks like today. Father Bernard Pettigen, the pastor, was approached by 3 women asking if these were the guys with Santa Maria. Pettigen was a bit blown away by the whole thing. And he assured them that he was. What he may not have understood at the time was that Christianity, he knew Christianity was outlawed, but he did not realize how brave these women were. If they had been wrong, they were literally approaching him under penalty of death. But he did say he's with that, and sometime in the middle of the night, later that week, the first Mass for Japanese citizens was celebrated again in Nagasaki, as the church learned of the Kakure Kirishitans, or the hidden Christians. In 1873, Christians were allowed to openly practice again, and all signs prohibiting the faith were removed. 1882, 3 Japanese priests ordained, the first since the ban. And by 1892, of the estimated 50 to 60,000 hidden Christians, roughly 30,000 of them had rejoined the Catholic Church. This presentation has been about an hour, and I'm only scratching the surface what's going on. I encourage anyone watching this video to read up on this, to learn more, because the history in itself is fascinating. A pastor I knew once referred to the Christians who died as the great unknown martyrs. And so I'm hoping by watching this video that you have learned today to know more about them and want to know their story. And I thank you all for watching the video. I hope you check out my books. The green one in the middle is the one based on Himeji Castle and the Himeji Castle cross. The first 2, the yellow and the green, include a character based on Takayama Ukon, the man who told both Hideyoshi and Nobunaga no on basically giving up his faith, and eventually would have to tell Ieyasu as well. No, he didn't. You can check out my website, waltmuscle.com. Look on YouTube for my YouTube channel. Look up Walt Muscle, and you'll find a number of lectures that I've uploaded, and you can watch them. And please follow and subscribe to be notified of more lectures. Thank you again for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed it. Have a good day.